Phylogeny is about phylogeny, which is the evolutionary history of a species or a group of species. One way in which biologists study the evolutionary history of species is by using systematics, which is classifying organisms and determining their evolutionary relationships. There's two parts to systematics. The part on taxonomy, which is how organisms are classified, and there's a system of classification. And the second part is phylogenetics, which is the actual evolutionary history. So tying those two things together is called systematics, which is a part of phylogeny. There are several tools used to determine evolutionary relationships. One is using and studying fossils from organisms. Another tool is using morphology, specifically homologous structures. So morphology is studying the actual structure itself. Homologous structures are those in which are thought to share a common ancestor. So again, like a bat wing compared to a human arm, internally we have similar bone structure, but externally we are not adapted the same way. The third tool is molecular evidence, so studying actual DNA, amino acids, and proteins. In looking at the chart at the bottom, upon glancing, when it says who is more closely related, I know, like me glancing at it, I see quickly two plants. But that's not in fact the case. The tulip at the bottom is an autotroph, so the way that this plant obtains its energy is from the sun. The mushroom or fungus is a decomposer, which is a type of heterotroph, so it needs to be able to consume something in order to obtain energy, and we eat and we consume that way, so we are also heterotrophs. So for that reason, we are more closely related to the fungus than the fungus would be to the tulip or plant. The branch of biology or science where organisms are classified and named is called taxonomy, and it's a really structured system before an organism gets its actual species, genus and species name. So when you look at the chart, we saw this before, anything that is alive at the top is put into categories based on its characteristics. So from being general, anything alive, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then species would be talking about one type of organism. So again, the mnemonic is do keep pots clean or family gets sick. Do being the domain, very broad and general, and then species would be very specific, talking about one again. And every one of these levels is called a taxon. So again, working from the top down, we get more and more and more specific about what type of organism we're discussing. Binomial nomenclature is where every single organism has a genus and species name that's in Latin. Using Latin, even though it's not common in everyday language, in the 18th century, this was a way in which scientists could communicate with one another, considering language barriers. So it was a way that all scientists agreed that Latin would be used. So even, words that we use today, common words like something general like fish, doesn't really give any specifics. So if I said crayfish, jellyfish, silverfish, Nemo fish, all these things that I just brought up are completely different organisms. So fish, even using the word fish, it doesn't really communicate, even in one language such as English, specifics. So using the genus species name, in Latin is very to the point. So looking at the diagram on the left, this is a different way of looking at it. It's not going like the last slide, top down, top being general, and then on the bottom being very specific. This is the same thing, it's just flip-flopped. So if you look at the bottom, domain is now at the bottom. The eukarya domain is for organisms which have eukaryotic cells. Getting a little bit more specific, that's an extremely broad category. We have kingdom, so the animal kingdom versus plant kingdom. So the leopard up at the top is in the animal kingdom. So now getting more specific, phylum Chordata. Chordata is for those organisms which have a spinal cord, like in their nervous system. For class, the mammals. So there's many characteristics of mammals, giving birth, being able to produce milk, having hair, which again, the leopard falls into that category. Order Carnivora. Sometimes the names tell you a little bit about the description of the organism. So the name Carnivora, these organisms are those in which eat meat, primarily for their food source. Family, Felidae. Felidae is for feline. Again, having certain body structure with the ears, having a tail, those would be claws, those would be characteristics of felines. Genus, Panthera. These are for cats which primarily roar, which all cats do not roar, even though I think my cats do, but they do not. And then finally, species, Panthera pardus, is exclusive with just the leopard. There is no other organism that's going to be talked about other than the leopard when you use that name. Now for the genus name, one thing that I almost forgot to say, there are 4 organisms or 4 cats that are in that genus, that roar. So leopards, as that's the one that we're talking about, jaguars, tigers, and lions. And then again, when we break them apart, each of them would have a specific species name. So like for the lion, it's Panthera leo, and that's exclusive in talking about a lion, or at least one type of lion. And I forgot to mention that this system, the naming system using Latin binomial nomenclature, was developed by Carolus Linnaeus. Using Linnaeus' system is really good and efficient for getting a specific name, but where its downfall is it doesn't show any evolutionary relationships between organisms other than maybe having the genus name be similar. But anything in a family, order, class doesn't show those relationships. So what scientists will use is a phylogenetic tree, and it's a type of branching diagram that shows evolutionary history of a group of organisms. So again, looking at the phylogenetic tree at the bottom, you can see that it's starting towards the left, very general, or relatively general at order, and then moving towards the right, the branches are going to be more specific. So order, Carnivora, again, organisms which rely on meat for their energy and survival primarily. And then family, and there's several families that are going to be shown in this diagram. And then genus, and then specific species, and here we get the actual binomial nomenclature along with the common name in English. So you read it from left to right. And in this case, just to discuss it a little bit, there's 3 families. So the feline, and then the group in the middle, Mustelidae, and I'm not exactly sure if that's the right way to say it, those are weasels. And then we have the Canidae, which are dogs. So felines versus weasels versus dogs. The number one, like turquoise circle, that's going to be a branching point. So that's going to be a spot in which it's thought that weasels and the dog family had a common ancestor. And then if we see towards the bottom, when we're looking at two different types of canines or genus, the Canis latrans versus the Canis lupus, which is the coyote versus the gray wolf, they have a branching point too. So it's thought again that the wolf versus the coyote most likely share a common ancestor. So please remember that those points indicate a common ancestor before they diverged or separated based on natural selection. Please take a few minutes to study this phylogenetic tree. It's a general phylogenetic tree, but there are some things that you need to understand about it, and it's on page 397 in your textbook. So looking at this again from left to right, the numbers indicate the branch points where there's likely a common ancestor. So you see the first branch, this would indicate as far left would be the oldest, and then moving right would be, in terms of time, the more recent. And again, at number one, there was something that caused the lineages to diverge, based on location, where they're surviving, where they're evolving based on natural selection. And so we have a general branch, and then you see at the bottom taxon G. This is what's known as a basal taxon, and it diverged and evolved separate from many, many, many other organisms. So it's kind of, from that that ancestor break, it's the oldest group that diverged early on in history. So then we have other branches taking place. So number 2 taking place and the organisms diverging, and then 3 and 5. Now, when we look at 5, there's, if you want to look at the taxons like organisms, so we like organism or group D, E, and F. And this is what's known as polytomy, which to me looks like polytomy. And this is where essentially classification isn't quite done yet. It's not really clear how these organisms have diverged from one another. And then up at the top, looking at 3 and 4, organisms, or the group here, taxon B and C, are known as sister taxa because they are thought to be most closely related to one another. And you can see that their branches are very short and kind of towards the right. So that would indicate they're really very similar to one another. So please study this, read page 397, and have an understanding about phylogenetic trees. So I might have mentioned this on the last slide. I did or I didn't, I'm not sure. Branch lengths indicate genetic change from that branch point, from where there's a divergence, a shared common ancestor, but now the organisms are becoming different essentially. So looking at this phylogenetic tree, again, we are not mice, but in terms of the organisms that we're being presented with in this phylogenetic tree, genetically, our chromosomes, our DNA, are most similar to a mouse, and that's being shown with small branches from that branch point. And even though there's not a dot here, it's still a branch point. I think this is what I said a slide ago. Branch lengths indicate or can indicate time as well as genetic change. So still using the same phylogenetic tree from the last slide. In On this one, luckily, we have a time scale, but you can also see that the lengths represent time, a short duration of time versus hundreds of millions of years ago. So again, genetic change and time. There are various different tree layouts for phylogenetic trees. There's circular or rooted trees, just straight rooted, which is primarily what we're going to be working with, and most likely you'll probably see on the AP exam, and then also an unrooted tree.